This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. In this episode, we're going to continue to learn the sequence of play with the movement phase. The movement phase enables the attacker to move their units and conduct other actions based on that unit's allotted movement factors. Think of movement factors as the points a unit has to move, to place smoke, recover a support weapon, or set a demolition charge. For every movement factor an attacking player spends, the defending units, if they have line of sight to that moving unit, may decline to act or engage them in defensive fire. Once the defender's response is resolved, players continue to go back and forth with the attacker spending movement factors in the movement phase and the defender responding with defensive first fire when eligible. Then the attacker selects another unit and repeats the process until they've moved all the units they choose to in this phase. Now that you have an overview of where these phases sit in the overall sequence of play, let's learn a little bit more about offboard units. Reflecting back on our setup for Scenario 1, retaking Veerville, this is the first opportunity for reinforcements to move onto the map. While units are off-board, the only action they can take is to move onto the map. Be aware though, off-board units must make their move onto the map during this turn's movement phase or the advancing phase, otherwise they are eliminated from the game. And a unit may not voluntarily leave the map unless it's in good order and exits as part of a scenario's victory conditions. Retaking Veerville is not one of these scenarios. Any unit otherwise forced to exit the map is eliminated. Now that we're caught up on our requirements for retaking Veerville, let's learn more about movement factors. Movement factors represent a unit's range of mobility during this phase. While the math is far from perfect, ASL uses movement factors to estimate the speed of a unit and its ability to traverse 40-meter hex spaces containing various terrain. This is based on a time frame that a player turn lasts approximately 2 minutes. Like many war games, the attacking player spends a unit's movement factors to buy their way into a terrain hex. Most terrain hexes cost a single movement factor to enter. Terrain hexes containing substantial obstacles like buildings and woods cost 2 movement factors to enter. In some scenarios, grain fields will be in season. This increases the movement factor cost of a grain field to 1.5. For defensive fire purposes though, this is rounded down and triggered as a single movement factor. For our purposes, I've revamped the unit movement factor chart from the rulebook to give you a better sense of all the movement options. In this chart, each row shows the unit type and class. Remember, multi-man counters like squads and half squads are classed based on their training and equipment. This also affects their movement factor capabilities. Single-man counters in Starter Kit number 1 are leaders and are treated the same for movement. Let's begin with the slowest rate of movement and work our way to the fastest. The first blue column is for assault movement. This is a special maneuver where units forgo their movement factors and cautiously move into an adjacent hex. So narratively speaking, the troops are quiet and advancing carefully, taking all their time to move a short distance. Assault movement allows the unit to avoid a die roll modifier for what is called first fire non-assault movement. This gives the defender a -1 to their dice roll on the infantry fire table when conducting a fire attack on a moving unit. Basically, by cautiously moving, it reduces the surprise of an attack. The next green column displays a unit's normal movement. This is what I call walking and talking movement. In the starter kit, most multi-man counters have a base movement factor of 4. You'll also notice that green and conscript units have one less movement factor than fully trained units, reflecting their inexperience or reluctance to fight. Single-man counters, like leaders, have 6 movement factors. If a leader has a wound marker, then their individual 6 movement factors are halved to 3. However, this leader wound penalty is not applicable when stacked with a squad or half squad. Maybe the men are wheeling the wounded leader around in a little wagon, like John Wayne in The Longest Day. I don't know. The next column shows what I call efficient movement. This is movement when directed by a leader. So basically you have a leader there saying, shut up and pick up the pace. This adds 2 movement factors to a unit's base movement. The interesting tidbit here is it actually adds 3 movement factors to a green unit, so I guess the extra leader support really helps the new guys. The last 2 columns cover double time movement. With double time, units may increase their movement factors by 2. At this speed, they don't care about noise, they're flat out running. This also stacks with leader-directed movement, so apparently running and yelling. Together, this increases the unit to maximum speed and adds 4 movement factors to their base movement. 2 movement factors for double time and 2 for being directed by a leader. Now the drawback to double time is it exhausts units. Therefore, place a CX counter on the unit to reflect this. When a unit is exhausted, it must add a +1 to any die roll. It has its IPC, or inherent portage capacity, decreased by 1, so it can carry less, and any unit making close combat against it has its die roll decreased by 1. One final note about double time: it cannot be used on back-to-back turns. At the beginning of the movement phase, CX counters are removed from the last turn. So, units suffering a CX from the last turn are no longer penalized during the current turn, but the unit cannot double time again until the next turn. And now that we have a better understanding of how movement factors are spent for traversal, let's discuss other ways that movement factors can be spent. During the movement phase, a unit with a smoke exponent may attempt to place smoke in a hex. They may spend 1 movement factor to make the attempt in the same hex as the unit, and 2 movement factors to attempt to place the smoke in an adjacent hex. After declaring their intention, the player will roll a single die. If the unit is exhausted with a CX marker, add 1 to the die result. If the die result is equal to or less than the unit's smoke exponent, then the attempt is a success. Place a smoke marker in the hex. If the die result is above the smoke exponent, then it's a failure. Be aware that no unit may attempt to place smoke grenades more than once per movement phase. Finally, if the die result is a 6, the unit also ends its movement until the next movement phase. Keep in mind, with smoke in a hex, there is a +2 hindrance that stacks with any other terrain hindrance. There is a +3 hindrance if the unit is firing out of terrain containing smoke. Finally, as a quick reminder, smoke counters are removed at the end of the movement phase. Similar to the rally phase, a moving unit may attempt to recover an unpossessed support weapon in the same hex. To make the recovery attempt costs 1 movement factor. The player then rolls a single die. If the unit is exhausted, add 1 to the die result. If the die result is less than 6, then the attempt is successful and the unit recovers the support weapon. If the die result is 6 or more, then the attempt fails. Be aware that there is a limit of 1 attempt per unit per support weapon. Also remember, when recovering captured equipment, to apply the appropriate penalties. And finally, let's discuss placing demolition charges. Placing and detonating a demolition charge spans 2 phases. Placement is done during the movement phase, and detonation during the advancing fire phase. An infantry unit possessing a demolition charge attempts to place it in an adjacent target during its movement phase by expending extra movement factors based on the terrain where the charge is placed. For example, placing a demolition charge in an adjacent terrain hex with a building would cost 2 movement factors. Essentially, the demolition expert has to move into the terrain, place the charge, and then get out. Keep in mind, for the purpose of defensive fire, the terrain that contains the unit is targeted, not the terrain where the charge is placed. A unit may not place a demolition charge if it has been prep fired or was pinned or broken prior to completing the placement attempt. So basically, the unit placing the demolition charge must remain unpinned and unbroken throughout the movement phase to detonate the charge in the advancing fire phase. When the advancing fire phase arrives, the player attempts detonation by rolling 2 dice. If the dice result is less than 12, the demolition charge explodes, causing a 30 firepower attack on any units in the hex. The detonation is resolved on the infantry fire table like any normal attack. If the unit placing the charge is inexperienced, in other words, a green or convict class unit, then they must roll below a 10. Not achieving the required result will mean the demolition charge has failed to detonate and is a dud. Remove the demolition charge counter from the board if this happens. And now that we've finished covering all the things that can be done with movement factors, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we're going to walk through defensive first fire. And with what we've learned here, we will go through step by step how the attacker's movement interacts with defensive fire. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel, click the bell icon for notifications so you'll know when the next episode becomes available. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.